I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week we talk politics with New York Times Metro reporter Nicholas Fandos. We'll discuss Bob Menendez's resignation from the Senate, the 2025 mayoral race, and the Kamala effect in Congress. The stage now appears to be set for November, Harris versus Trump. So let's start digging into the issues, starting with one that starkly divides them, immigration. Which party holds the keys to a more prosperous America? Joining us, Nobel Prize-winning economist and New York Times opinion writer, Paul Krugman. Paul, welcome and thank you for joining us. Paul, it used to be said by economists, among others, that immigration might be taking jobs from American workers. What's the prevailing wisdom now?
Okay, there was never much belief that immigrants would take away jobs. We thought that the labor market would adjust, but um, I used to think that that less educated immigrants might be competing with less educated native-born workers in a way that would reduce their wages. At this point, it's really, really clear that immigrants are not taking away jobs, that native-born employment is actually doing very well despite fairly high immigration, and there's really no sign of any of these other adverse effects. Basically, the economic consensus on immigration has become much more favorable in the face of evidence. Funny thing
But
like that.
you point out in your columns, too, that a lot of the employment growth has been among immigrants rather than
Yeah.
among the native-born. Why is that?
Okay, and this is a truth. The bit of truth to the starting point of the critique is, yeah, if you look at job growth, particularly if you start before the pandemic, we lost a lot of jobs during the pandemic and then got them back, that most of the job growth has gone to immigrants. But why is that? Is that because the immigrants have taken away jobs? Would those jobs have gone to native-born Americans otherwise? And the answer is a very clear no. The reason why employment growth has been very low for native-born Americans is that us native-born Americans are getting old. We're reaching retirement age. There's been a big drop-off, large numbers of baby boomers leaving the workforce voluntarily. We've had low fertility for a long, long time now. So the pool of potential workers who were actually born in the United States is barely growing. So if we're going to have a vigorous growth in the economy, which we have had, it has to be coming largely from immigrant workers.
You point out another advantage to immigration. Maybe this is a little bit cynical, but you say that immigrants will be paying taxes when they work, but they won't be collecting Medicare or Social Security for a long time. So that will be building up the surplus.
Oh, that part is not actually cynical. I mean, that's kind of what we want. It's kind of why people have worried about demography, have worried about the fiscal impacts of low fertility as the population ages, and immigrants who come in who are working age are exactly what the doctor ordered. They pay taxes for a number of years. Immigrants, tend not to come in close to retirement age. They arrive mostly at working age and pay taxes into the system, which help fund Social Security and Medicare. Now, the part that's slightly cynical is undocumented immigrants, although, we do want to try and control that. From a fiscal point of view, that's kind of great. That's people who come in do pay payroll taxes because those are collected at the employer level, but are not eligible for benefits. So, that's a cynical point. I don't want to make too much of it, but the truth is that overall, it's immigration actually does wonders for the U.S. Fiscal outlook.
You've written a lot about Donald Trump. You talked about his acceptance speech. You've poked holes in a lot of what he said over the years, and certainly recently. But now you seem even more worried about J.D. Vance, his running mate. Why is that?
Well, I mean, the two things. First of all, for Trump, although can we say this? He's not a young man. Doesn't look like he's taking very good care of himself. So J.D. Vance could very easily become president. And Trump is scary. He has terrible authoritarian impulses. There's a lot to really dislike and worry about a Trump presidency. Vance is more than that. He's a fanatic. He's a Christian nationalist. He's someone who attacked Kamala Harris as a childless cat lady who is miserable and wants to make the rest of us miserable, which is actually kind of funny because Republicans are also attacking her for laughing too much. But still, uh, and I think the main point is that Vance has much more clearly enunciated policy positions than Trump, who is all over the place. And so the choice of Vance gives us a better focus on what a Trump administration, a new Trump administration might mean. And it's scary as heck.
You're also scared because he's smarter, you say.
Yeah, I mean the now uh, we don't know how much this will matter, but Trump did less damage than he might have during his first term because I don't know if he's stupid, but he's lazy. Trump really just doesn't get stuff done. Vance is, he's smart. Hillbilly Elegy is a cleverly written book. I think it's actually, if you read it closely, it's really an extremely nasty book, but it was certainly cleverly written. So, and if we're going to have a bad guy running the country, better that the bad guy be not too bright and not too hardworking, because that means he'll do less damage.
Vance has changed his position from the time he's written that book. How do we know what to believe that he believes in?
Well, that's always a good question. I mean, um, he's clearly a chameleon who is, chooses what he claims to believe based upon what the people backing him, actually largely Silicon Valley tech bros, want him to say he believes. But I think that there's uh, a genuine hostility basically to America as it is. One thing that I mean, I've been leaning on his remark about the miserable cat ladies, partly because I think it's revealing. It tells you something about who he is, what he values, and basically what he doesn't value are people who don't live a traditional sort of Christian nationalist lifestyle.
I thought Republicans loved Wall Street and hated unions. What's happened?
They still hate unions. There's not a hint. I mean, there's a lot of talk about being pro-worker, but in reality, I mean, whatever is going on with the Teamsters, most of the labor movement is well aware that the Republican Party is extremely anti-union. And look, they go after Wall Street. That's pretty much rhetorical. I mean, what is true is that uh, the favorite plutocrats of the current GOP are actually tech bros rather than Wall Street honchos. But there's plenty of Wall Street money in there too. I mean, Trump may talk about Wall Street barons or whatever, but his heart really isn't in it.
And Vance himself was brought about, supported by the tech industry too.
Yeah, but Vance is essentially a protege of Peter Thiel, the reactionary Silicon Valley guy, and a coterie around it. So really, this is if you like, this is a candidacy of the plutocracy, but it's kind of the West Coast plutocracy as opposed to the traditional New York plutocracy.
When the Republicans talk about making America more affordable, what do they mean, and is that a good thing?
Well, I don't think they know what they mean. They uh, do they mean bringing inflation down? In which case they haven't noticed that that has already happened. Inflation is running under 3%, maybe a little high relative to the Federal Reserve's target, but fundamentally inflation is under control. If they mean reversing, we saw roughly a 20% rise in prices all across the advanced world in 2021, 2022, which was largely, I think, given the fact that it was a common experience across the advanced world. It had more to do with pandemic-related disruptions than anything else. Are they really saying that we want to bring it back down? That we want to get the consumer price index back to what it was in 2020? I hope not, because if there's one thing that is an absolute constant in economic history, it is that deflation on that scale has catastrophic effects on the economy. That's how you go about having a depression.
Paul, a report in the Times the other day that race has come to play a smaller role in upward mobility, while economic class seems to be the greater determination. What are the implications of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not at all clear. I mean, I would wait a while before we conclude that race has become irrelevant. Maybe it's a little bit less relevant, but the main thing is that we actually are in general a society now with relatively low social mobility. It's not we still think of ourselves as the nation where people pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and but if in reality, among wealthy countries, we stand out as having much more of a sort of sustained class society than the rest, largely because we have so much inequality and largely because social services for poor kids are so poor.
Some relatively good economic news about economic growth at the end of this week. Do people care about that, or is there a total disconnect between general figures like that and people's own sense of the economy, of their economy?
Well, actually, the funny thing that you see in surveys is that most people, if you ask people, how are you doing? Most people are pretty positive. If you ask, how is your state or your city doing? Most people are fairly positive. If you ask them, how's the national economy doing? They say, oh, it's terrible. So people seem to believe that bad things are happening to somebody else, somebody they don't know. And whether the GDP numbers will, I would guess that I'd be surprised if one voter in 20 is aware of what the latest GDP numbers say. I mean, but what is true is that the economy is solid. I mean, it certainly would be a problem for Kamala Harris at this point if the economy were sliding into a recession. And it clearly is not yet anyway. And so whether I have a guess, it's just a speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if the fact that the Democrats, that Biden has stepped aside and they have a new candidate, if you don't suddenly see a jump in perceptions of the economy, which makes no sense at all. It will be the same economy, but I think that a lot of people, when you ask, how's the economy doing, the question they answer is not the question you asked.
Last question by me is, does the deficit matter anymore?
Oh, at some point, first of all, the deficit is one reason why interest rates are high. The federal government is spending more than it's taking in, and that does pump up demand. And so the Fed has to keep interest rates high to keep the economy from overheating. And if you go, there has to be some limit somewhere to how much debt the federal government can take on. But everything we know says that that limit is incredibly high. I mean, we have debt that's around 100% of GDP now. If you look at Britain at the end of World War II, it had 250% of GDP as debt and never had a crisis. So it's not that debt doesn't matter, but if I had to make a list of things that worry me about America, debt and deficits would certainly not be in the top 5 and probably not in the top 10.
Thanks, Paul, for joining us. You can read Paul Krugman's economic and political opinions throughout this election cycle in the New York Times opinion section. And coming up next, Democrats rally around their new candidate. Lots of political news this week. Joining us to discuss the latest developments, New York Times political reporter Nicholas Fandos. Nick, we were talking about the impact of what happened the past couple of weeks on New York, the New York congressional races, the roles played by Chuck Schumer and by Hakeem Jeffries. What does the new dynamics of the race mean for New York congressional races that really may hold the House of Representatives majority in the balance.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to start. Remember, there's about a half dozen competitive House races here in New York. That's more than the Republican majority margin right now in the House. So the House really, could flip here in New York if Democrats play their hand right, or Republicans could hold on.
Which the Democrats didn't do the last time.
Right. They had a terrible performance in New York in 2022 and have spent 2 years trying to rebuild here. I think Joe Biden dropping out of the race and Kamala Harris getting back in has kind of turned the entire political world upside down, obviously. But for Democrats in New York, I think early indications are it's a good thing. Before Biden dropped out, they were getting polling from some of these swing districts in New York that was just abysmal. Their candidates were outrunning the president, but he was down by double digits in districts that he won, in some cases by 10 points 4 years ago. So, places like, Mike Lawler's district in the Hudson Valley and part of Westchester, parts of Long Island were just completely coming off the map for Democrats. I think those are back in now, and we're back to a real kind of 50-50 dogfight. Some of the races they feel a little better about, where they have stronger candidates. Some they feel a little worse about. But there's kind of energy and enthusiasm and on the Democratic side, which now matches the Republican side.
And they're now in play, at least.
Right. That puts them back in play. I think they feel better about their chances in a Syracuse-based district and on the South Shore of Long Island than a couple of the Hudson Valley seats that Republicans currently hold.
Is there or was there any chance that Donald Trump would have been competitive statewide in New York?
There were a round of headlines in the last few weeks around that. It's certainly a provocative question. It reminded me a lot of, every 4 years I feel like we read stories about, could the Democrats win Texas this time? And then they end up losing by double digits. New York is still an overwhelmingly Democratic state. I don't think anyone seriously thought Donald Trump had a chance of winning here. But the fact that the race could have been a 10-point race rather than a 20-point race did speak to Biden's erosion, the erosion of his standing across the country. I think we'll see those numbers as we get new New York polls in the next few weeks really jump back up for Democrats. I don't think either campaign is going to be presidential campaign is going to be spending a lot of time or money here.
Nick, what did the two New York congressional leaders, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, what role did they play in persuading Biden to drop out and to having the Democrats, in effect, coronate Kamala Harris and not have an open convention?
Yeah, well, they played significant roles, and I think it's becoming clearer as time passes a little bit. Both of them were trying to keep a lot of their actions behind the scenes. We saw Nancy Pelosi, the former speaker, showing her hand a little bit more as she tried to push Biden aside. But they both took the attitude of, listening to their members who wanted Biden gone, and then each of them had a private meeting with the president in the weeks before he dropped out, where they tried to show him, among other things, polling that showed not only him down, but them losing the House and Senate if he stayed in the race. And I think the idea was to try and pierce the tight bubble of loyalists that were around the president, who they felt were not giving him good information. And, in so much as he stepped aside, they can now take some credit for that. We haven't seen them taking victory laps, of course, because, they're not trying to stir divisions. They don't want to, tick the guy off, but they've lined up quickly behind Harris as well.
If Harris wins, she would break a number of precedents. Interestingly, she doesn't seem to have the same baggage that Hillary Clinton had when she ran. What's the difference in the campaigns, would you say, or the candidacies?
Well, I think it's too early to say what the differences are in the campaigns, but one salient difference is that Hillary Clinton had just been a fixture in American political life for such a long time by the time she ran for president. She had been First Lady and was a well-known First Lady who people developed opinions about at the time because she, pushed back against certain traditional gender roles. She'd been the Secretary of State. I think there's a lot of people who think they know Kamala Harris but don't really know her and are about to be or are being reintroduced to her right now. And that may be to her benefit. She gets a fresh chance to, with relatively little baggage, introduce herself to the American people. And whether she's successful at defining herself, for instance, as a prosecutor, as she's been leaning heavily on in the last few days, or the Trump campaign is able to do the job for her and define her as a extreme liberal, may determine whether or not she can win this election or not.
Is she an extreme liberal?
Well, it's an interesting question. Her career has kind of meandered this way and that. She was for much of her career a prosecutor and then the Attorney General of California, which is a law enforcement position that tends to be, at least these days in the Democratic Party, seen as more centrist or conservative. But when she was elected to the Senate, she had, I think, the most liberal voting record for the 4 years that she was in the Senate of any senator. And in the Biden administration, she's been pretty close to the president, which I would, people can characterize as they want what his administration has been.
Speaking of the Senate, Bob Menendez in New Jersey, the first senator to be convicted for representing a foreign government. Is there any chance he'll run in November as an independent?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. So he announced this week that he would be resigning his seat in the Senate rather than face an almost certain expulsion vote. But he has, for now, left his name on the ballot in New Jersey for November as a political independent. There's reasons to do that allow him to continue to raise and spend money for his legal defense fund through his campaign. So that may be what he's up to. But he could decide, I want some revenge. I'm going to put my name on the ballot. There's no chance he would win. I mean, he's polling, beneath the floor. But if the race were close, he could siphon some votes away from the Democrat, Andy Kim, and make that contest competitive. Now, again, with Harris in the race, I think Democrats are breathing a little more easily about that scenario. They think Kim will easily win New Jersey, which is another solidly Democratic state that was starting to look pretty close with Biden at the top of the ticket.
It's a little less than a year before the likely Democratic primary for mayor. How are things shaping up? Are there real alternatives to Mayor Adams? Is he really going to get a challenge to re-election, assuming he runs? There have only been 2 times in recent history, Abe Beame and David Dinkins, that an incumbent has not been reelected. What are Adams' chances?
Right. The incumbency is quite powerful in New York. I mean, he's got unions and big business interests with him because he's the incumbent mayor, and has raised quite a lot of money. So far, 2 challengers, somewhat formidable, have lined up to run against him. One is Scott Stringer, the former comptroller, who was a mayoral candidate in 2021, who was running quite strongly for a while and then had accusations of sexual misconduct kind of tank his campaign. He is back. And then a state senator, Zelnor Myrie, who is a progressive from Brooklyn, but not terribly well known, not only in the city, but among the kind of Democratic establishment that he would need to get some support from to win. There are other candidates that may get into the race. The current comptroller, Brad Lander, who's quite far to the left, and perhaps Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, who is flirting with a potential run. But it remains to be seen whether they'll actually get into the race. I think right now it's about trying to pull together money and figure out what a winning coalition pathway could be. I don't think voters are really going to be tuning in all that much until after the presidential race.
No, I'm sure voters aren't, but the politicians will be. Right. Is the main goal now raising money rather than anything else? Is that what the strategy is at this point?
Yeah, I think that's the earliest way that a candidate could show, look, there's a broad base of support for me, and I would have the resources to get my message out and compete against the mayor, who is sitting on a very large war chest. Scott Stringer so far put up the best numbers. None of the candidates, kind of blew it out of the water, but they showed that they'll have the resources to be able to compete, and that's what we're going to continue to keep our eyes on, in the next 3 to 4 months.
And I guess more variables coming into a mayoral primary are ranked choice voting, and also if a lot of candidates run against the mayor, they will split some of that opposition. So again, another thing that makes it hard to predict. Nicholas Fandos of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, my thoughts on changing the city charter. Think that city government works at a snail's pace? Think again. Mayor Adams convened a charter revision commission. It held hearings, drafted 5 amendments, and has now voted to place them on the November ballot. All that in just 9 weeks. By doing so, the mayor managed an end run around the city council. The council wanted its own changes to the charter, but only one set of charter changes can be considered at a time. So say so long to the council's proposal to impose its veto power over some 24 mayoral appointees. That's how the Senate works in Washington when the president nominates ranking federal officials. The council is not the U.S. Senate, though. The council has also wanted more say over how City Hall administers the criminal justice system. The Mayor's Commission countered by proposing bureaucratic roadblocks, more reviews, hearings, before the council imposes any legislation concerning public safety. That was in response to council legislation that would have banned solitary confinement in city jails and required more reporting by cops on their encounters with the public. If the council was inspired to seek power over mayoral appointments by the Senate's confirmation process, the Mayor's Commission was galvanized by legislation in Washington that has given the president more control over Congress. Another charter change would require that before a public hearing is held on any proposed local law, the financial impact of that law must be analyzed. That's a direct reaction to the council's bill to expand the eligibility for housing vouchers. It makes sense. Charter revision may seem arcane and dull compared to the presidential campaign, but it's bound to affect most New Yorkers one way or another. So a word of warning, read the fine print. Also, the mayor's speedy power play suggests that he's capable of responding fast and efficiently when he wants to. 9 weeks to change the charter? Even for a New York minute, that's a record. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.